In this lecture, we'll review the literary context for Samuel Beckett's Endgame. When people think of Beckett's Endgame, they often imagine it as taking place in an apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic setting. This comes from numerous references throughout the text to the end of things, including seemingly eternal things like time and nature, as well as the more local lack of people or any other evidence of life in general. Note how in McPherson's film adaptation, the room where all the action takes place in Endgame is depicted as having nothing in it. The walls are barren, the characters' clothes are tattered, their movements appear feeble, and the general color scheme is dull. All this helps to reinforce the sense that the setting is apocalyptic. We'll encounter ideas of the apocalypse again with Haruki Murakami, so I want to make sure that we have a clear conception of what an apocalypse in literature entails. There are at least two basic types of apocalypse which can then be further differentiated and specified. The two basic types to begin with are entropic and catastrophic apocalypses. An entropic apocalypse is an end brought about by a process of decline or decay. Some of you might be familiar with the term entropy, or the term second law of thermodynamics, or heat death, which are all associated with entropy. All of these ideas are born from the 19th century and early 20th century when the development of industrial and transportation engines made it necessary to have a better understanding of how heat and energy work. Simply put, entropy is waste, disorder, or energy that is no longer usable. It's the stuff that has reached an equilibrium with its environment. A textbook example of an entropic system is a hot cup of coffee in a cold room. The heat from the hot cup of coffee will eventually reach an equilibrium with its environment. The air around the cup will become warmer while the coffee itself will become cooler. In general, the whole system might become lukewarm. When this happens to things like steam engines, which rely on the heat of steam to move the engine pistons, they stop working. That is, when a steam or coal engine reaches such an equilibrium, they stop working because the heat necessary to keep the engine moving is no longer available. Our bodies are also kind of like engines. Eventually, we will reach an equilibrium with our environment. In a really broad sense, we will no longer be able to keep warm against the cold winters, or be able to keep cool in the hot summers. And this equilibrium with our environment indicates we are dead. Note that most of these examples involve some kind of failure or demise. Well, if we trace the second law of thermodynamics to its ultimate logical conclusion, we end up with the death of the whole universe. That is, by the end of the 19th century, scientists were wondering what's to stop all things from reaching a complete equilibrium with all other things. If all things in the cosmos reach an equilibrium, this is called a heat death. The universe itself will be dead, the sun will be cool, the earth a barren wasteland, and all life dissipated. For the early 20th century, with the invention and use of things like machine guns, tear gas, and nuclear bombs, this idea of heat death became pretty popular in literature. It seemed to speak to the many kinds of decay artists observed all around them, not just in their own bodies, but in culture and morality. Then, with the progression of the 20th century, the metaphor of entropy also became useful to aptly capture the idea that humans are increasingly suffocating themselves in the waste and disorder of mass culture, the products of commercialism and commodification being entropic, or things of no real value. So to recap, entropic apocalypses can include the slow decay of things like heat, life, and time. The aging of the human body results in an individual entropic apocalypse. Entropic apocalypses can also include the decay of more abstract things like culture and morality. The move away from humanism and towards capitalism is considered a type of entropic apocalypse by some. Catastrophic apocalypses are the opposite of entropic apocalypses. They involve definitive events that indicate a difference from what came before and what came after. For instance, the bombing of Hiroshima in World War II is considered a catastrophic apocalypse. It was a definitive event that not only changed Hiroshima but ruptured the way world powers and people understood war and humanity. The Holocaust of World War II works the same way. When people found out what was happening at those camps, it shattered the worldview they had up to that point. Another way to think of catastrophic apocalypses is as traumatic. Traumatic events for individuals and cultures are so overwhelming that they defy comprehension. So just as entropic apocalypses can happen at the individual and global level, catastrophic apocalypses can also occur at the individual and global levels, wrecking one's physiological or psychological states, or devastating whole cultures or the world environment. An asteroid hitting Earth, for instance, is a catastrophic apocalypse. You'll notice that a lot of these apocalypses invite questions about meaning. For instance, an apocalypse of self entails failure to self-actualize. In the Enlightenment unit, we've talked about how the human identity has been explored as a duality of mind and body, of the material and immaterial. With this conception, since the 17th century, people have been feeling as though they're experiencing an apocalypse of self, as they're told that they're nothing but matter, mechanical systems of various organs and networks, machines with no soul. The suggestion is that if we're nothing but matter, that even those things we thought were immaterial, like intelligence and emotion, can be boiled down to material systems and laws, then it becomes increasingly difficult to defend any search for meaning at all, because the only meaning that exists is natural and physical law. Another example of an apocalypse of self we'll see in our last two works is the master-slave apocalypse. We've come across the idea of the master-slave dialectic with Dostoevsky and Kafka. The idea is that the psyche is composed of two parts, a master and slave. Self-consciousness is achieved if both parts recognize the other as similar to the self rather than other or different. This is kind of like saying when you meet a stranger, you can recognize them as human, like you, and you can fully empathize with them despite their race, sex, age, etc., because you recognize that, like you, they suffer, have dreams, have value, etc. Within the psyche, though, the master and slave parts of the consciousness battle for superiority. At first, the master may appear superior because he orders the slave, and the slave may appear inferior because he follows the master's orders, but eventually the two might realize that the master is in fact a slave to the slave's labors, making the slave the new master. A real-life example of this can be seen in a factory. The factory workers would be the original slaves, and the CEO would be the original master, but because the CEO doesn't actually know how to make any of his products, eventually the laborers may realize they have power over the CEO and become the new masters. When laborers strike, for instance, they are relying on the CEO recognizing that he or she is in fact dependent upon them and a slave to them. So an apocalypse of self with this master-slave dialectic occurs when the master or slave portions of the consciousness kills off the other, preventing any kind of true self-actualization to take place. As I mentioned, we'll get a chance to see this kind of apocalypse in both Beckett and Murakami. One last apocalypse of self we'll see is with the self identified by memories. Marcel Proust, a French novelist whom we'll see explicitly referenced early on in Murakami's Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, as well as influencing Beckett's concepts of time in Endgame, is famous for exploring the importance of memory to identity. The basic question is how much of our identity is reliant upon memory. The question exists because intuitively we might be tempted to say that obviously without our memories we would not be who we are today. But Proust points out that our memories change all the time. We forget and likewise remember things all the time. For Proust, this epiphany was catalyzed when he dunk a cookie in his tea and was reminded of a happy childhood memory of his aunt's home. This was a memory he didn't know he had, but was involuntarily recalled by the taste and smell of his cookies soaked in tea. I think we've all had experiences like Proust when we remember something that we haven't thought about in years, perhaps a memory we didn't even know we had. Proust's conclusion, then, was that identity must be recreated. We must seek to recall our memories and integrate them with our present selves. The apocalypse occurs when our conception of time is obliterated. There is no such thing as past, present, or future, but all is the same. The past self, present self, and future self must recognize each other simultaneously in an all-illuminating moment. The takeaway here is that apocalypses don't have to result in just meaninglessness, but actually often result in the creation or discovery of new meaning. The original meaning of apocalypse means to uncover, unveil, or reveal. That's why in the Bible we associate the apocalypse with revelations. In fact, in biblical terms, an apocalypse is not an event at all, but a revelation. In literature in general, then, we can think about apocalypses as destructive events that through their destruction bring clarity. Thus, the apocalypse is traditionally never actually an end. There is instead the post-apocalypse, the struggle to survive, to recoup, to reconstruct, and so forth. Beckett's Endgame finds absurdity in this fact, and in this week's reading we'll get to see how he deals with this paradoxical idea that the process of ending is itself never ending. So let's talk about Beckett. Samuel Beckett was born in Dublin, Ireland, grew up in a middle-class Anglo-Irish Protestant family, and attended Trinity College in Dublin. But much of his adulthood is shaped by his travels all over Europe, and in 1937 he decided to spend the rest of his days in Paris, France. He participated in World War II by joining an underground resistance group in France, and eventually he was forced to flee to the south of France when the Germans began arresting members from his group. By the 40s, he adopted French as the primary mode for his writing, as opposed to English. As your Norton intro tells you, writing in a second language helped him to achieve the minimalist effect he pursued in much of his literature. If you've ever read James Joyce, who writes in a very expansive, encyclopedic way, you can consider Beckett as the complete opposite of Joyce, seeking instead to reflect what he felt was the severe and stark realities of the post-war period. This mood is also captured in the scenes of Beckett's work, where characters recycle movements or don't move at all, props are kept to a minimum, and landscapes are barren. Beckett originally wrote his play Endgame, our reading for the week, in French, and only translated
translated it to English afterwards, but he was deeply dissatisfied with the translation, calling it the one-act horror. Despite being a minimalist, Beckett wrote extensive production notebooks detailing how his play Endgame must be produced. For instance, when he was directing, he would tell his actors to assume an attitude first before speaking, making it seem as though they can't move and talk at the same time. Yet, as an absurdist, Beckett also made no effort to explain the meaning of Endgame or his copious stage production notes to anyone.